Get him out of here, right now! The words cut clean through the polished air of the lobby, sharp enough to turn heads before anyone even understood what was happening. Conversation stalled mid-sentence. The soft hum of elevator doors seemed to pause. Even the quiet clack of dress shoes against marble slowed, as if the entire building had taken a breath and forgotten how to release it. Ryan Whitmore stood near the front desk, posture straight, suit crisp, his voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be repeated. In front of him, just past the wide glass doors that framed the Manhattan street outside, stood a man most people had already decided didn't belong. Ethan Brooks didn't move. His coat was worn at the edges, the fabric dulled by time and weather, the kind of jacket people passed without noticing twice. A faint layer of city dust clung to his shoes, and his hands, rough and steady, hung at his sides without urgency. But his eyes, calm, observant, unsettlingly steady, didn't match the image anyone had already formed of him. Ryan took a step forward, lowering his voice, but somehow making it feel louder. "This is a private building," he said, each word measured, practiced. "You can't just walk in here." A few people nearby shifted uncomfortably, pretending to check their phones while watching everything unfold through reflections in the glass walls. A woman near the concierge desk adjusted her handbag, her gaze flickering between Ryan and Ethan, unsure whether to leave or stay. The lobby itself gleamed under the warm overhead lights, polished marble floors reflecting gold accents from the fixtures above, everything designed to communicate quiet wealth, quiet control. And right now, Ethan stood in the middle of it like a disruption no one knew how to process. Still, he didn't argue. Didn't raise his voice. He simply looked past Ryan for a moment, as if measuring the space, as if remembering something no one else could see. Then, gently, almost politely, he spoke. "I just need 5 minutes inside." The request was simple. Too simple. It didn't come with an explanation, didn't carry the usual tone of apology or desperation Ryan had come to expect in moments like this. That, more than anything, tightened something in Ryan's expression. His jaw set just slightly, the smallest crack in his otherwise controlled demeanor. "That's not how this works," Ryan replied, a faint edge creeping into his voice now. He gestured toward the doors without looking at them. "You need to leave." The words hung there, heavier this time. A security guard near the entrance straightened, already reading the situation without needing further instruction. The subtle shift didn't go unnoticed by the people watching. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else took a slow step back, as if distance might make the moment less uncomfortable. Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to his hand, where his fingers had curled loosely around something small, something barely visible. A key. Old, worn at the edges, its metal dulled but not forgotten. He turned it slightly between his fingers, the faintest glint catching the lobby lights before disappearing again. Then he looked back up, meeting Ryan's eyes, not with defiance, not with anger, but with something quieter. Something steadier. 5 minutes, he repeated, softer this time, like a statement rather than a plea. Ryan let out a short breath through his nose, the kind people use when they've already made up their mind. He didn't look at the key. He didn't look at Ethan's eyes for more than a second. To him, the situation had already been decided the moment it began. "No," he said firmly, turning slightly toward the guard. "Escort him out." The words were efficient, practiced, designed to end things cleanly. And as the guard took a step forward, the glass doors behind Ethan reflected the entire scene back at them. The polished lobby, the well-dressed crowd, and one man standing still in the center of it all, holding something no one had bothered to notice. The security guard hesitated for half a second before closing the distance, not out of doubt, but out of instinct, as if something about the man in front of him did not quite fit the usual pattern he had been trained to handle. Ethan Brooks did not step back. He did not tighten his posture or prepare to argue. He simply shifted his weight slightly, the worn sole of his shoe pressing against the cool marble floor, and let his gaze drift once more across the lobby as though memorizing it piece by piece. The chandeliers above cast a soft, golden glow that reflected in the polished surfaces around him, and for a fleeting moment, His expression changed almost imperceptibly, not into a smile, but into something quieter, something closer to recognition. The guard cleared his throat gently, lowering his voice in a way that contrasted with Ryan Whitmore's earlier command. "Sir, I am going to need you to step outside," he said, careful, measured, professional. Ethan nodded once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if he had expected this exact moment to unfold long before he ever stepped through the doors. Around them, the observers shifted again, their attention sharpening now that the situation had moved beyond words. A man in a tailored navy suit paused near the elevators, pretending to scroll through his phone while watching the reflection in the mirrored panel beside him. Two women near the reception desk exchanged a glance, their expressions caught somewhere between curiosity and quiet discomfort. No one spoke. No one intervened. The building, for all its elegance, had rules that were rarely questioned, and Ryan Whitmore stood at the center of those rules like a fixed point no one challenged. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the small key in his hand, the metal pressing into his palm, grounding him in a way nothing else in the room could. He turned it once more, slowly, deliberately, as though testing the weight of it against the moment. Then, without urgency, he began to walk. Not rushed, not forced, just steady, each step measured as he moved toward the glass doors. The guard stayed close but did not touch him, maintaining a respectful distance that seemed to confuse even himself. Ryan watched the movement unfold with a composed expression, though something in his eyes flickered briefly, a trace of irritation, or perhaps uncertainty, gone as quickly as it appeared. To him, the situation had already been resolved. Order had been maintained. The disruption was being removed. That was how it always worked. As Ethan reached the threshold, the outside light spilled in through the glass, cooler, sharper than the warm tones of the lobby. The city beyond moved at its usual pace, yellow cabs rolling past, distant horns echoing between buildings, the rhythm of New York continuing without pause. Ethan stopped just before stepping out, his hand resting lightly against the door handle. For a moment, he did not open it. Instead, he looked back over his shoulder, not directly at Ryan, but across the space, taking in the room one last time. The marble, the desks, the people who had already begun to look away now that the tension was fading. Then his eyes settled briefly on Ryan Whitmore. Not angry. Not pleading. Just steady. Observing. As if measuring something unseen. The silence stretched for a breath longer than expected. Then Ethan pushed the door open and stepped outside. The glass closed behind him with a soft, controlled click, sealing the warmth of the lobby away from the cool air of the street. Inside, the tension dissolved almost instantly, replaced by the quiet return of normalcy. Conversations resumed in low voices. Shoes clicked against marble once more. Someone laughed, a little too quickly, as if to erase the moment that had just passed. Ryan adjusted his cuff slightly, smoothing out an invisible crease, his posture returning fully to its composed, authoritative stance. He did not look at the door again. Not yet. But somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the practiced control and the certainty of routine, something small had shifted, something he could not quite name, something that lingered in the space Ethan Brooks had just left behind. Outside, the air felt sharper, thinner, carrying the faint scent of exhaust and cold concrete as Ethan Brooks stepped fully onto the sidewalk, the door sealing shut behind him like a quiet conclusion to something unfinished. He did not immediately walk away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, just off to the side of the entrance, where the reflection of the glass still held a faint image of the lobby behind him. Cars passed in a steady stream along the avenue, their tires whispering against the pavement, while a distant siren echoed somewhere beyond the grid of buildings. The city moved forward without pause, indifferent to what had just happened inside. Ethan slipped his hand into his coat pocket, the small key still resting in his palm, its edges familiar, grounding. He pressed his thumb along its worn grooves, tracing it slowly, as if remembering something tied to more than just metal. Across the street, a digital billboard flickered between advertisements, casting brief flashes of color across the glass facade of the building he had just exited. For a second, The reflection shifted, distorting the image of the entrance, turning it into something almost unrecognizable before settling back into its clean, polished symmetry. Inside, Ryan Whitmore stood behind the reception desk now, reviewing something on a tablet handed to him by the concierge, his expression composed, his posture precise. To anyone watching, the moment from earlier had already been filed away as a minor interruption, nothing more than a routine enforcement of rules. But Ryan's focus was not as steady as it appeared. His eyes skimmed the screen, but his mind lingered elsewhere, replaying a detail he had not meant to notice. The way Ethan had looked at the space. Not with confusion. Not with hesitation. But with familiarity. Ryan dismissed the thought almost immediately, tightening his grip on the tablet as if that alone could anchor him back into certainty. He handed it back with a brief nod, his voice calm, controlled. "Make sure all entrances are monitored closely this afternoon," he said, his tone measured. "No exceptions." The concierge nodded quickly, already moving to relay the instruction, while the security guard returned to his post near the door, his gaze drifting outward for just a moment longer than necessary. From where he stood, he could still see Ethan across the threshold, unmoving, almost blending into the city around him. The guard shifted his stance, then looked away, as though unsure why the image lingered in his mind. Outside, Ethan finally took a step forward, not away from the building, but along its edge, his hand brushing lightly against the cold stone wall as he walked. His pace was slow, deliberate, as if each step carried weight beyond distance. He stopped near a narrow side panel where a small, discreet plaque was mounted beside a service entrance, barely noticeable unless someone knew to look for it. The metal surface had dulled slightly over time, but the engraved lettering remained clear beneath the thin layer of wear. Ethan's gaze settled on it, steady, quiet. For a moment, the noise of the street seemed to fade, replaced by something more internal, something measured in memory rather than sound. He did not touch the plaque. He did not need to. Instead, he reached into his pocket again and pulled out the key, holding it between his fingers now, letting the faint light catch its surface. The shape matched something here. Something hidden in plain sight. Inside the building, a phone rang sharply at the front desk, cutting through the ambient noise with a tone that demanded attention. The concierge answered quickly, her voice polite, practiced, but her expression shifted almost immediately as she listened. Her posture straightened, her eyes flickering toward Ryan with a subtle urgency that had not been there before. "Sir?" she said, lowering the receiver slightly as she turned toward him, her voice quieter now, but edged with something unfamiliar. "There is a call for you." Ryan glanced up, mildly annoyed at the interruption, but something in her tone made him pause. "Who is it?" he asked. The concierge hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, as if confirming what she had heard. Then she met his eyes. "They said it is regarding the owner?" The word landed differently. Not loud, not dramatic, but heavy enough to shift the air between them. Ryan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before he masked it again. "Put it through," he said, his voice steady, though something beneath it had changed. Outside, Ethan closed his fingers gently around the key once more, his gaze lifting from the plaque back toward the glass doors, where his reflection met him again, calm, patient, waiting. Ryan Whitmore lifted the receiver slowly, his fingers steady out of habit rather than certainty, and brought it to his ear while the faint noise of the lobby continued around him, muted now, distant, as though something had shifted just enough to separate him from it. "This is Ryan," he said, his tone measured, professional, the same tone he had used 100 times before in conversations that never carried consequence beyond schedules and logistics. There was a brief pause on the other end, not static, not silence, but something intentional, like the space before a sentence that mattered. Then a voice came through, calm, controlled, unmistakably certain. "This is Lawrence Hayes from Brookfield Holdings. I am calling regarding the building on Madison Avenue." Ryan straightened slightly, his posture tightening in a way that did not go unnoticed by the concierge standing nearby. Brookfield Holdings was not a name that came up casually. It sat several levels above the daily operations he managed, tied to ownership structures he rarely interacted with directly. Yes, Ryan replied, a trace of caution entering his voice now. How can I assist you? Another pause, shorter this time, followed by a question that did not sound like a question at all. Were you aware that the owner is on site today? The words landed with a quiet weight, not loud, not aggressive, but precise enough to unsettle something in Ryan's chest. He glanced instinctively toward the glass doors, toward the reflection of the street beyond, though he could not see Ethan clearly from where he stood. No, Ryan said carefully, choosing each word. I was not informed of any visit. On the other end, the voice did not change. Then allow me to clarify. The owner arrived approximately 10 minutes ago. Ryan's grip on the receiver tightened slightly, a subtle shift that only he felt. 10 minutes. His mind moved quickly, aligning timelines without permission. The entrance. The man. The request for 5 minutes. The key. He swallowed once, keeping his voice level. I see, he said, though he did not. Not fully. Not yet. And where is he now? This time, the pause stretched longer, deliberate, as if allowing the realization to form on its own rather than forcing it. That is precisely the issue, the voice replied. He was just escorted out of the building. The sentence did not rise in volume. It did not need to. It carried enough weight on its own. Ryan's gaze fixed on the glass doors now, no longer a reflex, but a focus. The reflection showed movement inside, people resuming their routines, unaware of what was unfolding in this quiet exchange. Outside, just beyond the glare, a figure stood near the edge of the frame, still, composed. There must be some misunderstanding, Ryan said, though the words felt thinner than he intended. His mind replayed the moment again, slower this time, sharper. The calm voice. The steady eyes. The absence of resistance. Details he had dismissed as irrelevant now pressed forward with uncomfortable clarity. There is no misunderstanding, the voice answered evenly. His name is Ethan Brooks. The name settled into the space between them like something final. Ryan did not speak immediately. For a fraction of a second, the controlled environment he operated within every day seemed to lose its edges, its certainty. He saw it now, not as a disruption, but as a moment he had misread entirely. I would advise, the voice continued, that you correct the situation immediately. The line did not disconnect right away. It lingered, as if waiting not for a response, but for acknowledgement. Ryan lowered the receiver slowly, placing it back onto its cradle with a precision that masked the shift in his breathing. The concierge watched him carefully now, sensing the change even without understanding it. Sir? She asked quietly. Ryan did not answer right away. His eyes were already on the door, fully now, no longer peripheral, no longer dismissive. The reflection shifted as someone passed by, briefly obscuring the view, then clearing again. Ethan Brooks stood outside, exactly where he had been, as if he had never intended to leave at all. Ryan exhaled once, steadying himself, though the feeling in his chest had changed. No longer irritation, no longer control, but something unfamiliar, something heavier. He adjusted his jacket, smoothing it down out of habit, but the motion felt different now, less certain. Around him, the lobby continued as if nothing had changed, but to Ryan, everything had. Without another word, he stepped out from behind the desk and moved toward the entrance, his pace controlled but faster than before, each step echoing faintly against the marble, carrying with it the quiet realization that the rules he had enforced just minutes ago no longer applied in the way he thought they did. The doors ahead reflected his approach, merging his image with the man waiting on the other side, two figures moving toward the same point from entirely different worlds. The glass doors slid open with a soft mechanical whisper just as Ryan Whitmore reached them, the controlled environment of the lobby giving way to the cooler, sharper air outside, and for the first time since the moment began, he stepped beyond the boundary where he had always held authority without question. The city noise pressed in immediately, distant engines, faint horns, the steady rhythm of footsteps along the sidewalk, but all of it seemed muted beneath the singular focus in his mind. Ethan Brooks stood a few feet away, exactly where he had been, his posture unchanged, his presence calm, as if time had moved around him without ever touching him. Ryan slowed his pace as he approached, not out of hesitation alone, but because something in him understood that the tone he had used before no longer applied here. For a brief second, he said nothing, and that silence stretched in a way that felt heavier than any command he had given inside. Ethan turned his head slightly, acknowledging him without surprise, without tension, his eyes steady, observant, the same quiet composure that had unsettled Ryan earlier now impossible to ignore. "Mr. Brooks," Ryan said finally, the name feeling unfamiliar on his tongue, yet precise, deliberate, chosen carefully. The shift was subtle, but it carried weight. It was no longer, "sir," in the generic sense, no longer an anonymous dismissal, but recognition. Ethan did not respond immediately. His gaze lingered on Ryan for a moment, not assessing, not judging, simply present. Then, slowly, he lowered his eyes to the key still resting in his hand, turning it once more between his fingers as if the metal itself carried a story Ryan had not yet earned the right to hear. "You did not need 5 minutes," Ryan continued, his voice quieter now, stripped of the sharp authority it held before. "You already had the right to be here." The words sounded controlled, but there was a faint tension beneath them, something close to uncertainty, something unfamiliar to a man who had built his role on certainty. Ethan lifted his gaze again, meeting Ryan's eyes, and for the first time, there was a shift, not dramatic, not confrontational, but something that carried meaning. "I wanted to see if I still did," he said, his voice calm, even, measured in a way that did not seek approval or validation. The answer landed softly, but it carried more weight than Ryan expected. It was not about access. It was about something deeper, something tied to how people were seen, or not seen, in spaces they had every right to occupy. Ryan inhaled slowly, the city air cooler than the controlled temperature inside, and for a moment he seemed to search for the exact words that would restore balance, that would correct what had already happened. "There has been a misunderstanding," he said, though the phrase felt insufficient even as he spoke it. "I was not aware of who you were." Ethan's expression did not change. He did not nod. He did not reject the statement. He simply listened, as though the explanation itself revealed more than the words intended. "You were aware of who I appeared to be," Ethan replied quietly, and the distinction settled between them with quiet clarity. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition. The truth of it was immediate, undeniable. He had made a decision based on appearance, on assumption, on a system he had enforced without question for years. And now, standing here, those assumptions felt exposed in a way he had never experienced before. A gust of wind moved between them, light but noticeable, brushing against Ethan's coat and carrying a faint chill that contrasted with the warmth still visible through the glass behind Ryan. Inside, people moved as they always did, unaware that the balance of the space had already shifted. "I would like to make this right," Ryan said after a moment, his voice steadier now, though no longer commanding. It was something else. Something closer to request than instruction. Ethan considered him for a brief second, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged. Then he glanced back toward the building, the reflection of the entrance catching both of them again, one inside, one outside, though the boundary between those roles had already begun to blur. "You already did," Ethan said softly. Ryan blinked once, the response unexpected, incomplete in a way that forced him to pause. "By showing me exactly what I needed to see." The words were not harsh. They were not spoken with anger. But they carried a clarity that settled deeper than any reprimand could have. Ethan closed his fingers around the key once more, then stepped forward, not waiting for permission, not asking for guidance, simply moving toward the entrance as if the path had always been his. Ryan stepped aside instinctively, the motion small, almost automatic, but significant in a way that could not be undone. The glass doors opened again, reflecting both men as they crossed the threshold together, but this time, the difference between them was no longer defined by who belonged and who did not, but by who understood the weight of that distinction and who was only just beginning to learn it. The moment Ethan Brooks stepped back into the lobby, the shift was immediate but unspoken, like a change in pressure that no one could see but everyone could feel, and yet no one dared to acknowledge out loud. The same marble floors reflected the same warm light, the same quiet hum of conversations continued, but something beneath it had altered, something subtle and irreversible. Ethan walked forward at the same steady pace as before, his shoes brushing softly against the polished surface, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, as if the events of the last few minutes had not disrupted him at all. But now, the space responded differently. People who had once looked past him now noticed him without meaning to, their eyes lingering a fraction longer, their bodies shifting slightly to make room as he passed. No one spoke. No one asked questions. But the awareness was there, quiet and spreading, like ripples in still water. Ryan Whitmore followed a step behind, not leading anymore, not directing, just present, his usual authority replaced by something more restrained, more watchful. He could feel the eyes now, the same people who had once looked to him for cues, now glancing between him and Ethan, sensing the change without understanding it. The concierge stood straighter behind the desk, her hands resting lightly on the polished surface, her gaze flickering between the two men before settling downward again, unsure where to place her attention. The security guard shifted his stance near the entrance, his posture no longer rigid, but attentive in a different way, as if recalibrating something internal he could not quite name. Ethan slowed as he reached the center of the lobby, his gaze lifting toward the upper levels, where glass railings framed the floors above, each one identical in structure, each one carrying the same quiet precision of design. His eyes moved across the space not like a visitor, but like someone recalling something long known, something built from memory rather than observation. He stopped beneath the chandelier, the soft light catching the edges of his coat, illuminating the subtle wear in the fabric, the contrast between where he had been and where he now stood. For a moment he said nothing. The silence around him deepened, not forced, but natural, as if the building itself had paused again, waiting without knowing why. Ryan remained still behind him, his hands now loosely at his sides, no longer occupied with devices or instructions, his mind no longer anchored in routine. He watched Ethan carefully, not with suspicion, but with a kind of attention that felt new, unpracticed. "You built this to be invisible," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach Ryan without drawing the entire room into the conversation. Ryan blinked once, the statement unexpected, not because of its content, but because of its perspective. "Invisible?" he repeated, his voice softer now, more reflective than defensive. Ethan nodded slightly, his gaze still lifted toward the architecture above. "Clean lines. Neutral tones. No distractions. Everything designed so people feel comfortable." Without asking why, his eyes lowered slowly, meeting Ryan's again. "It works." The simplicity of the observation carried more weight than any critique. Ryan glanced around the lobby as if seeing it for the first time, not as a system to manage, but as a space to understand. The symmetry, the lighting, the controlled environment, all of it suddenly felt less like perfection and more like something curated to a point where certain things, certain people, could disappear without being noticed. "I thought that was the goal," Ryan admitted quietly, the words coming slower now, less certain. Ethan's expression remained calm, but there was a faint shift in his eyes, something reflective, something that held both understanding and distance at the same time. "It depends on who you are," he said. The statement settled between them, simple, undeniable. Around them, the lobby continued its quiet rhythm, but the awareness lingered, the subtle shift in perception that could not be undone. A man stepped aside to allow Ethan to pass without being asked. A woman lowered her voice mid-conversation as he moved through her line of sight. These were small changes, almost invisible, but they carried meaning, the kind that did not need to be announced to exist. Ethan took another step forward, his hand briefly brushing against the smooth surface of a column as he moved, grounding himself in the physical space, connecting to it in a way that went beyond presence. Ryan followed again, not out of obligation, but because he no longer knew how not to. For the first time since he had taken this position, he was not guiding the space. He was learning it. And as Ethan moved deeper into the building, not as a guest, not as an exception, but as something entirely different, the structure around them remained the same, yet felt completely changed, as if the truth of it had always been there, waiting for someone to see it clearly enough to bring it into the light. Ethan Brooks stopped near the base of the grand staircase that curved gently along the far side of the lobby, its polished railing catching the warm light and soft reflections that stretched upward toward the higher floors, and for a moment he simply stood there, looking up, as if measuring not the height of the building but the distance between what it was and what it had become. Ryan Whitmore slowed behind him again, careful now, aware that every step he took felt less like control and more like following something he did not fully understand yet. The quiet movement of the lobby continued around them, but the rhythm had changed, more restrained, more aware, as if the building itself had begun to listen. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the key once more, holding it between his fingers at chest level, letting the light reflect off its worn edges, and this time he did not turn it idly. He held it still. Intentional. Measured. Ryan's eyes followed the movement, drawn to it now with a clarity that had been missing before. The shape. The age. The way Ethan held it, not like an object, but like something that belonged to a place rather than a person. "There is a door upstairs," Ethan said quietly, his voice calm but carrying a direction that did not ask for permission. "Third floor. East corridor. It has not been used in years." Ryan's brow tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition. He knew the building well, every floor, every hallway, every secured access point. And yet, the detail Ethan described sat just outside his routine knowledge, something he had passed by without ever needing to question. "Maintenance access," Ryan said slowly, recalling the faint outline of a corridor he rarely visited. "It has been sealed off." Ethan's gaze shifted toward him, steady, unhurried. "Sealed does not mean forgotten." The words settled between them with quiet precision. Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gestured toward the elevators without speaking, the movement less directive than before, more like an offering of direction than an instruction. Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and began to walk. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the mirrored interior that reflected both men as they stepped inside, their images standing side by side, equal in height, equal in presence, yet separated by something deeper than appearance. As the doors closed, the outside world narrowed to the soft hum of the ascending mechanism, the numbers lighting up one by one as they moved upward. Ryan glanced briefly at Ethan's reflection, studying him not as an interruption now, but as a presence that carried weight beyond explanation. Ethan did not look at the mirror. His gaze remained forward, steady, as if he had already been here long before this moment. The elevator slowed, then stopped with a soft pause, the doors opening onto the third floor where the lighting was slightly dimmer, the air quieter, less traveled. The corridor stretched out ahead, clean but less polished than the lobby below, its silence carrying a different kind of stillness, one that had not been shaped by constant movement. Ethan stepped out first, his pace unchanged, his footsteps soft against the carpeted floor, and Ryan followed, the distance between them closing slightly, not out of necessity, but out of something unspoken. They moved down the hallway together, passing identical doors, each one marked, each one part of a system Ryan had always trusted. But near the far end, the corridor shifted. The lighting dimmed further, the walls narrowing slightly, the design no longer centered on visibility but on function. And there, just as Ethan had said, stood a door. Plain. Unmarked. Almost invisible against the wall unless someone knew where to look. Ryan slowed, his breath catching just slightly, not from exertion, but from realization. "I have never opened this," he admitted quietly, the words more to himself than to Ethan. Ethan stopped in front of the door, lifting the key once more, holding it up to the lock, the metal aligning perfectly as if it had always been waiting for this exact moment. He did not insert it immediately. Instead, he looked at Ryan, his gaze steady, clear, not accusing, not forgiving, just present. Some things are not meant to be seen by everyone, Ethan said softly. But that does not mean they should be ignored. Ryan felt the weight of the statement settle deeper than anything that had been said before. He nodded once, slowly, not out of agreement alone, but out of understanding that was only just beginning to form. Ethan turned back to the door, the key hovering for a brief second before sliding smoothly into the lock, the faint click echoing in the quiet hallway, small but undeniable, a sound that marked not just access, but revelation, something hidden finally being brought into the open. The key turned with a soft, deliberate click, a sound so subtle it barely echoed in the quiet corridor, yet it carried a weight that neither man could ignore, and for a moment, Ethan Brooks did not push the door open. He simply rested his hand on the handle, as if allowing the moment to settle fully before moving forward. Ryan Whitmore stood just behind him, his breathing steady but slower now, his attention fixed not on the door itself but on the quiet certainty in Ethan's movements, a certainty that did not seek permission or approval, only acknowledgement. Then, without hesitation, Ethan pushed the door open. The hinges moved smoothly, almost silently, revealing a space that felt entirely different from the rest of the building, not polished, not curated, but real in a way that the lobby below was not. The room beyond was dimly lit by a row of tall windows, their glass slightly clouded with age, allowing soft daylight to filter in without sharpness, casting long, gentle shadows across the floor. Dust particles floated slowly in the air, visible only where the light touched them, drifting without urgency, undisturbed by the constant movement that defined the floors below. The walls were lined with old architectural plans, framed but worn at the edges, each one detailing earlier versions of the building, designs that had once been considered before being replaced by the clean, modern aesthetic now on display. A large wooden table sat in the center of the room, its surface marked by time, faint scratches and impressions left behind by hands that had worked there long before either of them had stepped inside. Ethan entered first, his steps quiet, almost reverent, as if he were not discovering the space, but returning to it. His gaze moved across the room slowly, taking in each detail, each mark, each piece of history preserved in silence. Ryan followed, slower this time, the difference between this room and the rest of the building impossible to ignore. It felt less controlled, less designed for perception, more grounded in purpose than presentation. He glanced at the plans on the walls, noticing how the earlier designs were different, more open, less restrictive, as if the building had once been intended to invite rather than filter. "This was never meant to be hidden," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the stillness. He stepped toward one of the frames, lifting his hand just enough to trace the edge without touching it. "It was meant to remind people what the foundation actually is." Ryan looked around again, slower now, seeing the contrast more clearly, the difference between what had been preserved here and what had been prioritized downstairs. "Why was it closed off?" he asked, his voice lower than before, less certain. Ethan turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "Because it did not match the image anymore." The answer was simple, but it settled heavily in the space between them. Ryan exhaled quietly, the realization forming not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual clarity, something that had always been there, just outside his awareness. He stepped closer to the table, running his hand lightly across its surface, feeling the uneven texture beneath his fingertips, a contrast to the smooth perfection he had always managed below. "I enforced that image," Ryan said after a moment, not as a defense, but as a recognition. Ethan nodded once, not in judgment, but in acknowledgement. "You protected what you were told mattered," he replied calmly. "That is not the same as understanding it." The distinction lingered, quiet but undeniable. Ryan's gaze lowered slightly, not in shame, but in thought, the weight of his role shifting in his mind, no longer defined solely by order and control, but by something more complex, something he had not been asked to consider before. "And now?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying more than it appeared. Ethan looked toward the windows, the soft light outlining his silhouette against the muted background. "Now you decide what matters," he said. The room fell silent again, but it was not an empty silence. It was filled with presence, with history, with the quiet understanding that something had been revealed, not forced, not imposed, but shown. Ryan stood there for a moment longer, absorbing it, feeling the difference between managing a space and understanding it. Then, slowly, he nodded, not as a gesture to Ethan alone, but as a response to something deeper, something internal that had shifted in a way he could not ignore. Ethan turned back toward the door, his movement calm, unhurried, as if the purpose of this moment had already been fulfilled. Ryan followed, but this time, the distance between them was gone, not because their roles had changed on the surface, but because the understanding between them had begun to close the gap that had once defined everything. The door closed softly behind them as Ethan Brooks stepped back into the corridor, the quiet of the hidden room lingering like a presence that refused to fade, and for a moment neither man spoke as they walked side by side toward the elevator, their footsteps muted against the carpet, their reflections faint in the dim glass panels along the wall. The building felt different now, not because anything visible had changed, but because something had been understood, something that could not be unseen once recognized. Ryan Whitmore reached the elevator first this time, his hand hovering briefly over the button before pressing it, the small light illuminating beneath his finger, a simple action that somehow carried more awareness than it ever had before. The doors opened, and they stepped inside together, the mirrored walls reflecting them once again, but the image no longer felt divided in the same way, no longer defined by assumption or distance, but by a quiet alignment that had formed without force. The descent was smooth, the numbers lowering one by one, each passing floor marked by a soft chime that echoed faintly in the enclosed space. Ryan glanced at Ethan, not quickly, not out of habit, but with intention, as if trying to see him clearly for the first time rather than through the lens he had relied on before. Ethan remained calm, his posture steady, his gaze forward, the key now resting loosely in his hand, no longer turned or examined, simply held, as if its purpose had already been fulfilled. When the doors opened to the lobby, the light returned, warm and polished, the same as before, yet carrying a different weight as they stepped out together. Conversations quieted just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to register the shift. People noticed, even if they did not understand what they were noticing. Ethan walked forward at the same measured pace, moving through the space with quiet certainty, and this time, no one questioned it. No one redirected him. The path ahead of him opened naturally, not out of instruction, but out of recognition, subtle and unspoken. Ryan followed beside him, not behind, not ahead, but alongside, his presence no longer asserting control over the space, but existing within it, aware of it in a way that changed how he moved through it. They reached the center of the lobby, where the light from above reflected softly across the marble floor, and Ethan paused for a brief moment, his gaze lifting once more, not searching, not measuring, but simply present. The building stood as it always had, structured, refined, controlled, but now it carried something else beneath the surface, something quieter, something more human. Ryan stopped beside him, his hands still, his posture relaxed in a way that did not come from habit, but from understanding. He did not speak. He did not need to. The moment did not require explanation. Ethan turned slightly, his eyes meeting Ryan's, not with judgment, not with expectation, but with a calm acknowledgement that carried its own kind of finality. Then, without another word, he stepped forward again, moving toward the exit, his pace unhurried, his presence steady, as if he had always known exactly where he belonged, regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. The glass doors opened before him, the outside light spilling in, cooler, sharper, contrasting with the warmth behind him, and he stepped through without hesitation, the city waiting just beyond. Ryan remained inside, standing still for a moment longer, watching as Ethan moved onto the sidewalk, blending once again into the rhythm of the street, yet no longer invisible in the way he had been before. The door closed gently, sealing the space, but not the understanding that had formed within it. Ryan exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief second before lifting again, not toward the door, but across the lobby, seeing it now not as something to control, but as something to respect. Around him, The building continued as it always had, but the way he stood within it had changed, quieter, more aware, as if he had finally heard something that had always been there beneath the surface, waiting to be understood. And in that stillness, without words, without announcement, the space held a new kind of balance, one that did not rely on who was seen or unseen, but on the simple truth that belonging was never defined by appearance, only by the way it was recognized.